tens of thousands of people came, as you saw those in the pictures, and we went from Kitaygorod, from Slavianskaya Square down the Moscow River and then onto the bridge and past the spot where he was killed. And I remember there was just people just kept coming and coming and coming, and there was so many people, and that was the day after. So he was killed on the 27th, and then on the 28th of February, Dmitry Peskov, who is Vladimir Putin's press spokesman, when he was commenting on the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, he said, basically, it's something to the extent of, who was he? He was just an average citizen. And that's actually a direct quote, average citizen. That's a quote from Putin's press spokesman. And then the following day, tens of thousands of people came and marched in memory of that quote-unquote average citizen. And I remember, and then 2 days later, it was the funeral, March 3rd, and the ceremony was at the Sakharov Museum, the Sakharov Center on Yauza River. And it lasted for several hours, but we had to wind down because we had to go to the cemetery. But for those several hours, you know, there was a line of people from the Yauza to the Kursky Railroad Station all the way down the Garden Ring. And most people didn't even have time to go because, again, it was getting dark. It was March. We had to go to the cemetery. And I remember his wife, Irina, said, I think it was already when we were at the cemetery, she said that, you know, he didn't think that so many people actually supported him and cared about him, and that he was important for so many people, because, you know, when we have been subjected to this Kremlin propaganda for years and years, every day, that, you know, people like us do not exist. Everybody in Russia loves Putin and nobody cares about the opposition, nobody cares about the Democrats. And I think after a while, even some of us are beginning to kind of subconsciously believe that maybe there is something to that. Of course, it's absolutely fake. There's no truth in that at all. But when this is hammering down your head every day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you inevitably start maybe partially believing this. And I remember when all those people came, and she said that, she said, he didn't know that so many people actually cared and supported him. And I think it's actually important to keep that in mind as well, how different that propaganda image created by the Kremlin-run state television, how that actually differs from reality and from what's actually happening in the country.
I remember hearing his mother, who was 90, Dina's 91, 90?
She just turned 90 in March.
So 3 years ago after, she marched in the funeral or in that march? I remember
she was
like
not
4
in the
miles.
march.
Didn't she walk 4 miles?
Not on the year, I think, but her birthday was actually the day of his funeral. The day of his funeral, she turned 87. So just a few weeks ago, she turned 90.
That's right.
March 10th.
Why was it important to you to make this movie? What was your objective?
I just wanted to show the real Boris Nemtsov, the real person. It was actually more important for me to show the person than the politician. I hope I was able to show both, but it was more important for me to show the person, the individual, because it's very painful to watch and to hear all those lies and all that slander that's continuing, by the way. If you watch Russian state TV, they're still continuing to fight Boris Nemtsov, even today, even posthumously, spreading all this nonsense and all these lies about him. And I just wanted to show who he actually was. I always say that I hope this film is a portrait. That's what I want it to be, a portrait. Just for as many people to see him, how I saw him, how I knew him, how those of us around him knew him. And it was, of course, very important for me to show this film in Russia. And we did in 37 cities in Russia. We had public screenings like this, of this film. And now, of course, it's available openly online.
You continued to do that after you were poisoned the first time. I remember seeing coverage of you in Chelyabinsk, and I'm like, oh my God, what is he doing? He's still showing that movie.
No, well, actually, when I was poisoned the
you.
first time, I'd only just started filming it. So I filmed the first few interviews, and then I was poisoned, and then I was in a coma, then I had to recuperate for months and months, and then I went back, and I resumed work on this film. So then actually I finished it, and we had the premiere. And by the way, it was a point of principle for me that the Russian premiere would be in Nizhny Novgorod, not in Moscow. I wanted it to be in a place where I think he was the happiest and the best years of his life was spent. So we had the premiere in Nizhny, and then of course we did have the screening in Moscow, in Petersburg, and other places. I took it to Novosibirsk, to Barnaul, to Tver. I had time to take it to 11 different cities across Russia, and then I was poisoned for the second time, and then my colleagues and friends have carried on. So as of now, 37 cities in Russia have held screenings of this film. And now it is, as I mentioned, it's publicly available online, both in Russian and the English subtitle version, so anybody wants to see it can see it anytime. Nemtsovfilm.com is the film's website.
And what did you learn from Boris in your 15 years working with him? What are some of your main takeaways from your mentor?
I think the main thing I learned is that, there's a saying that's really popular in Russia. I don't know, maybe it exists in other cultures and other countries too, but it's certainly a popular saying in Russia, that politics is a dirty business. So many people say it and so many people think it. And I know that's not true. Because, politics is such that you make it. If you make it dirty, then yeah, sure, of course it's going to be dirty. But I've seen Boris Nemtsov do politics. And I know that politics can be clean, and it can be honest, and it can be principled, because it would have been so much easier, and certainly so much safer for him, to do what so many other so-called Democrats from the 90s did, which is to find themselves nice, cushy places under the current regime, either in business or in government, or in the worst case, leave the country and go into exile. But he chose the most difficult and the most dangerous path, because for him that was the right thing to do. He could not just stand idly by, on the sidelines and watch what Putin was doing and do nothing about it, because for him that would mean to be complicit. And he was not going to be complicit in what this regime is doing to our country. So I know that politics can be honorable and principled and clean, because I've seen him do it. And I think that's his main legacy. That's the main takeaway for me from him, from spending all those years with him. And by the way, I think this was the greatest blessing of my life, that I spent 15 years next to this man. I think that's the main message. That's the main legacy. That's the main thing that he's going to be remembered for. Politics can be honest.
It's fun as I'm watching this movie, because half of the people in the movie I worked with, and now I'm seeing them, 30 years later. I'm like, oh, that's how he looks like. Well, he's aged pretty well or something. But
Igor
Muskaev, oh my God, yeah. But
he was like 20-something when he was deputy.
He was
still pretty young today.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Do you remember Lysov as well? He was there.
Yeah, Lysov. So Lysov, I remember there shots of when people are holding up the numbers, right? And they're bidding. What we actually did was we broke apart the trucking monopoly in Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod, the oblast, is like the state. It's about the size of Ireland. And we took the trucking monopoly. And what was cool about Nemtsov's privatization programs, instead of just taking like a factory and saying, okay, now it's private, buy stock, and you own a piece of the factory, but the management hasn't changed. What he did is he took a whole sector and we broke it up into economic units. So like the milk trucks went with the special garage, and then we sold that unit off or put it up on an auction lot. Anyway, we organized all these auction lots, because the idea was you break apart a sector, you get rid of the monopoly management, you're injecting new management and competition, right? Immediately, overnight. And we've got this, and Lysov was in a panic. He's like, no one's gonna buy these trucks, no one's gonna show up, man. No one's gonna show up. Do you know how much your starting price is divided by what a pensioner earns? This is going to be a complete failure. And then what Nemtsov and Bystander-Wherever, the mayor, did was they said, listen, half of the value of the truck is going to go to the proceeds is going to go to the federal government, and the other half is going to the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast and the city. And you know what? We're going to accept privatization vouchers. So we actually beat Chubais out of the gate. The very first privatization voucher was used at our truck auction, and the place was packed, and all these ordinary people started bidding, and it was crazy. And so because we were having the first privatization voucher, which was very bold, almost the entire Russian cabinet showed up. We had 2 airplanes, we had international press, it was just crazy. But he's very bold in that way, and a visionary. So why did Yeltsin choose Putin over Nemtsov or anybody?
Well, first of all, I don't think he did, because if you remember just the physical state that President Yeltsin was in by the end of 1999, I'm not sure how much he was actually even aware of what was happening. I know this for a fact, including from speaking to people while I was making this movie, including to Boris Yeltsin's own daughter, which I think is a pretty reliable source, that Yeltsin wanted Boris Nemtsov to succeed him as president. That's what he wanted to see. And boy, what a different world would we have been living in today if that had happened. But there was just so many factors that intervened. One of them was, ironically, the fact that Yeltsin himself invited Boris to Moscow. I think had he stayed as governor of Nizhny, he would have become president in 2000, question about it. But they took him to Moscow, where they basically destroyed his reputation, and that's where the second factor comes in, and that was, of course, the smear campaign on television channels that I kind of a little bit cover there in the film. And I recently was having conversations with one of the people who was in control of those television channels back in the 90s. I'm not at liberty to say the name because it was a private conversation, but it was a very influential person back then. And he said, and I asked him, I mean, really? And you destroyed somebody's reputation because he wore white trousers? Is that? I mean, do you realize now what you have done? And this guy said to me what I think is an absolutely brilliant phrase. He said, but there was nothing else on him. That's all we could show, the white trousers. So we showed it over and over and over and over again. And so that was a big factor, of course, because we know how influential television can be. And then there were many other things. Of course, the financial crash in August, after which he had a chance to stay in government, but he didn't want to, as I also show in here. But I think the kind of the bottom line is, in all of this, is that in Boris, the human always prevailed over the political. And kind of his human qualities were always stronger than any political calculations. And I think the best example of that is when Tatiana Dyachenko came to Nizhny Novgorod in March of '97 to persuade him to go to Moscow and join the cabinet as the deputy prime minister. He knew this wasn't something he realized much later. He knew at that moment that this was the biggest mistake of his political life to agree to this. But he said, you know, there was Yeltsin's daughter crying, and she said, Dad always helped you, now he wants your help. He's asking you to help. He said, what could I do? And I think that's just such an illustration of how the human being in him always prevailed over the politician, always.
It's very funny. I flew to the States with him, and then we went out to Missouri and visited some farms, and Gephardt was the majority leader.
He was the majority, House Majority Leader. He
Newt
hosted
Gingrich was the minority. So those guys came over to Nizhny. And actually, Bill Mott, you're in the last row. Your team was over in Nizhny working on zerno with us in the farm decollectivization. But we went to Missouri, and I was on the plane, and to the human side, he's like a babushka. It was so funny. I was a couple rows in front, and he leapt over and closed my window because of the radiation. You know, he's a scientist first too. Didn't want me to get extra radiation. This could be bad for me later on if I was trying to have children. He was going down the airplane closing everyone's window. It's very sweet. You compared Putin's consolidation of power to Mussolini. Could you walk us through that? What that comparison?
I think, well, I'm a historian by education, as you know, and as all of us historians know, parallels are always, you know, incomplete and inaccurate, and they never really work. You cannot find a parallel for something. And there's always things that are kind of similar, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a precise parallel. But actually, if you look at the way that Mussolini consolidated power in Italy in the early 20s, and the way that Putin did it in Russia in the early 2000s, it was almost exactly the same, even the order of things. So the independent media, the opposition parties, the elections as an institution, the regional elections, parliament itself, step by step. Mussolini himself called it plucking the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. That was Mussolini's phrase. That's how he kind of saw the best way to destroy democracy. Don't do it, don't try to do it in a day. Do it incrementally, gradually, and carefully. And that's how Putin did it. It took him 3 years to dismantle democracy in Russia, from when he came to power at the end of '99 until, I would say, the year when Russia ceased to be a democracy was 2003. Because he did 3 different things in that 1 year. In June, he closed down the last independent nationwide television network, so established complete state monopoly over TV. In October, he, of course, imprisoned Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, who dared to behave independently, support the opposition, accuse the government of corruption, and so on. So by imprisoning him,
Open Russia,
he's the
the
founder of
organization.
Open Russia, yes. And so by imprisoning him, and they physically, the day after they arrested him, they put him into a physical cage. Well, I actually show it in the film, like a cage like in a zoo. And they invited state television cameras to film him, and they showed this picture, you know, to everybody in the country, in a very clear message that if you behave like him, you're going to end up like this. And so that was the second thing Putin did in 2003. And of course, the third thing he did was in December of 2003, when we had a parliamentary election in which Boris ran and I ran as a candidate for the Duma. This was the first time since the end of one-party Soviet rule when European observers assessed the Russian elections being not fair. Of course, we've had many of those since then, but that was the
You
first
can watch
one.
it on YouTube. The stuffing of the ballots, the different, you know,
Yeah, it was
underhanded,
back then. It was a
overhanded.
little bit. This is what's happening now. Back then, it was a little more subtle. So there was some ballot stuffing. It wasn't that. First of all, of course, there weren't no cameras back then, and
Right.
the internet wasn't as widespread,
nest.
and no smartphones. So even if it was, not many people knew about this. That was the reason why we had such massive protest in 2011. It wasn't the first rigged election, but it was the first rigged election that was so obvious to everybody. Because by 2011, everybody, at least in the big cities in Russia, had smartphones and Facebook and Twitter, so it's just immediately the pictures spread around the country. 2003 was more subtle. They put, you know, what we call administrative resource in action. So they used the resources of the state to, you know, to lean in support of pro-government candidates and to pressure and coerce anybody who was for the opposition. So they did it in kind of in a much more careful way than what we're doing today, but the end result was the same. The end result was a parliament without opposition. A parliament that, as its own speaker, Boris Nemtsov, has famously or infamously said, Parliament is not a place for discussion. He said it in December 2003, after that Duma was elected. So I would say, I mean, there was no specific date to which we can point to say that, okay, that's the date Russia stopped being a democracy and became an authoritarian system. But I think we can pinpoint the year, and the year is 2003.
And when you say that he consolidated power, he's consolidating power in Russia, and then he's testing the waters in the West. Can you talk about your theory of how he's testing the waters and our lost opportunities of sort of training him that he can't do that? Where did the West sort of miss their opportunity to curb his Putin's approach now in the world?
Why did it not miss the opportunity? I think
No,
would be a better
I
way of
know.
asking. It was
Crimea
really
was too late, though. You thought that's too late.
Oh my God, that was
that
15
was
years
like-
after he came to power. No, but
Right.
the thing is that, you know, it was never a secret who Mr. Putin was and what direction he would take Russia. You know, there's all this theory that, oh, but you know, it wasn't clear. Yes, it was clear. I remember the day when, you know, for a lot of my friends and colleagues and for myself, it became absolutely clear who Vladimir Putin was. I remember the specific
You've
date.
met him personally.
I have, yeah, but a long time ago. But this was December the 20th, 1999. He was still prime minister. He wasn't president yet. This was formally still Yeltsin's presidency, but it was the last 2 weeks of it. And on that day, Putin went to the Lubyanka, to the KGB headquarters, and officially unveiled a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov, the chairman of the Soviet KGB, who oversaw the invasion of Budapest of Hungary in 1956, the Soviet ambassador, who was chairman of the Soviet KGB, instituted the procedures to fight and destroy political dissent. So he set up the 5th Directorate, which was specifically tasked with fighting against dissidents, and he instituted and expanded, in fact it was instituted before, but he massively expanded the practice of so-called punitive psychiatry, whereby people who were opponents of the communist regime were declared to be mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in
They
psychiatric
performed
hospitals.
lobotomies on some of them.
And they gave him so-called treatment, haloperidol. Now there's one of the people, Vladimir Bukovsky, who we saw in the film, he had to endure this, for example, as did many other people. And so Vladimir Putin went and opened a memorial plaque to that guy. I don't think there was any place for doubt. And Russia's a country of symbols. And this is the first symbol that he kind of pointed to. And then within the first year of his presidency, he reinstated the music of the Soviet-era Stalinist national anthem as a national anthem of Russia, something that Boris Nemtsov vehemently opposed. He was in the parliament then, he was leader of the opposition parliament. Of course, he voted against it, but was in a minority. And so those were the two things that Putin did straight away. And after that, frankly, anybody who was willing to notice, there should have been no doubt in anybody's mind that what direction, you know, he would take our country in. And then, of course, very soon the symbols turned into the actual practical things. And he began to shut down independent television, he began to rig elections, he began to imprison his opponents, and all this time, he was given the red carpet treatment in all major Western capitals, in the US and in the European countries. I remember, I'll never forget this, 2 days after his government shut down the last independent television channel in Russia. 2 days after that, he was treated to a state visit to the United Kingdom with a royal reception at Buckingham Palace. And a reception at the City of London at the London Guildhall. I was there, I was a journalist at the time. I saw this, and it was just mind-boggling to see all these, you know, British establishment figures kind of bowing down and welcoming him. And of course, you know, what kind of message should he have received? Apparently it's okay. Let's do more of this, and he did. And it's, there was this school of thought, sometimes called realpolitik, among Western political leaders, according to which, let's find some sort of accommodation with him in international affairs. We don't care what he does inside Russia. We'll let him do whatever he wants. Well, first of all, I'm not going to say that, in my view, it's completely immoral, such a position. But even if we take that aside, it's also very short-sighted and very, kind of really stupid. Because
his views of Russia's borders included a couple countries, so it
well,
becomes international affairs rather quickly.
That's a consequence, but exactly. The thing is, if anybody who bothered to look at the modern history of Russia would see that the domestic repression and the external aggression are two sides of the same coin. One always follows the other. And there's no such thing as letting a dictator do what he wants inside, at least in the Russian case. And, finding common ground with him in international affairs, it's not possible. And so, sure enough, those Western leaders who have for years, turned a blind eye on election fraud in Russia, on media censorship in Russia, on the dispersals of peaceful demonstrations in Russia, on political prisoners in Russia, and so on. One day, they woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which is what happened in Crimea.
How about some questions from the audience? Yeah?
I was struck by one line in your film that said that Nemtsov thought that the change wouldn't come until the mid-2020s. I wonder what the basis of that was, and what you think of that prediction, and just everything behind that.
Right.
Did everyone hear the question?
I can repeat the question. So, the question was that I mentioned in my film that Boris Nemtsov said and thought that major political changes in Russia will only come in the mid-2020s. And why did he say that, and what do I think of this? That was the question. First of all, I have to admit, I always argued with him about this. We always argued, because I thought it's going to come much sooner. And we especially argued in December of 2011, when suddenly we had 100,000 people on the streets of Moscow protesting against Putin. And many people thought that would be the beginning of something similar to what had happened in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Serbia. And I remember we were arguing with him, really like shouting. I said, what are you talking about? Forget about your mid-20s. It's happening now. This is it. We've won. And he would say, no. It's going to be mid-2020s. And now the more I think back to his words, the more I think that he was right. So now I do agree with him post factum. So I think it probably will be in the mid-2020s. The reason he thought that is actually there were many factors. One is, as you know, Russia's a mystical country, and he did really believe, as I quote in the film, those 40 biblical years where Moses walked his people around in the desert so that they would forget slavery. That, again, Russia's a country of symbols. Russia's a country of mysteries, and he did really believe that that's the 40 years. If you count 40 years from the start of Perestroika from 1985, it would be 2025. But then there are also many other factors, more practical ones, like, well, first of all, just Putin's age. Of course, that was probably the least important ones, but still, he did also mention it, the fact that, formally speaking, Putin's last term will run out in the mid-2020s and 2024. So that was the least important one, because we know that they can change the constitution any minute they want to, but the two main important ones are the first ones. And so the more I think back to kind of our arguments with him, I think that he was right, and probably will be mid-20s. Of course, mid-20s now are only a few years away, 6 or 7 years away, so it's not that long. And I mentioned that I'm with the Open Russia movement, and one of the kind of the main, or probably the main focus of the work that we do is to actually already today be preparing for that future change and for that future transition. Because another thing we know from the modern history of Russia is that big political changes in our country can start like this, can start quickly and unexpectedly. And you mentioned the Berlin Wall.
And I did say 6 months ago,
Yeah.
I would not return to Russia until it was free, and last time I said that.
Yeah. So say more.
6 months away, everybody.
But
I hope to visit you in the Kremlin.
But even if you look back at the century, 1905, 1917, of course 1991, something that's in my memory. In 91, a regime that had stood for decades went down in 3 days. 3 days. That's what it takes in Russia. But there's a downside to this. And the downside is that nobody's prepared. And I think the bulk of the mistakes that were made by Yeltsin's government in the early 90s, and we can talk a long time about those, I think that was not through any bad intentions or through anything that they wanted to do. It's because they were just unprepared. I mean, how do you prepare for a power falling on you in 3 days? And so then, of course, the provisional government in 1917, if you want to go back there, how many mistakes they made. So, we come at it from the point of view that we cannot afford to again be unprepared when that time comes. Because we do not know precisely how or precisely when the Putin regime will exit the stage, but we do know that it will, because nothing is forever. And when it happens, it will be far too late to sit down and start figuring out, okay, what do we do next? We have to make those preparations now, and this is what we're doing.
Other questions from the audience? What are the different, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, a question really for both of you. I was in Russia in the 1990s, as you were. Throughout the 1990s, the United States struggled with how it would respond to these developments in Russia and how it might assist. And clearly, what we did not work out the way we all intended. In retrospect, looking back, how might the United States or the West in general have responded differently to events post-1991?
It's interesting. I remember when we were in Missouri, we went to the Anheuser-Busch, we went to some baseball game out there. I don't know baseball, sorry. Who plays what their team is anyway? We were in Gephardt's box or someone's box, and we were, some baseball game was going on, and I was drawing.
I'm with you on this, by the way. I'm Russian. I have no idea
I was
what
drawing this map of Russia, and I've got Gephardt there and everything. And then I bring in Boris, and I'm like, come over here. Okay, we've got to get the money out of Moscow. The Americans and the congressmen, the senators, they're just flying into Moscow. They're being really lazy. They're staying at the Kempinski or whatever. And they're just like funneling it all through Chubais and Jonathan Hayes. Remember, we had those Harvard guys who started doing insider trading, right? Our own guys kind of figured out how to make money. This is what you got to do. You got to funnel it out to the regions. We were circling, writing down the names of the region. Just don't go to Moscow. Moscow's like Washington, it's going to be bureaucratic. Like, that was our view, and they didn't. I mean, Washington, everyone just kept on going to Moscow, back and forth. And Chubais, at the time, we thought was a good guy. I mean, then he's not a good guy anymore. He's very, very corrupt, but at the time we thought he was good. And then the Americans in the Ministry of Privatization started insider trading. They weren't very good either, the ones in Moscow. What do you think, though?
So you kind of talked about it from more of kind of an economic investment perspective. I want to talk more from the foreign policy perspective. I think the biggest mistake the West in general, this is not just the US, the West in general made with respect to Yeltsin's Russia, the democratic Russia of the early 90s, is that it was at the end of the day not willing to fully embrace and fully accept that Russia as an equal partner. I'll give you one example. On December 26, 1991, the day after the red flag came down on the Kremlin for the last time, there was a North Atlantic Council meeting in Brussels, representatives of all NATO countries sitting around the table. And the Russian ambassador came in and he read out a letter from President Boris Yeltsin addressed to the Secretary General of NATO, Manfred Werner. And in that letter, President Yeltsin, it's now public, in that letter he raised the question of future Russian membership in NATO, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He did not even receive a response. And there were so many of these instances. I mean, for example, another thing that I think, another factor that's really important is that unlike other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we in Russia never had that incentive of future membership in the European Union. That was such a powerful incentive for reforms in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and all these other countries. Even Ukraine, exactly. We never had that. And so it's actually kind of astonishing that the same Western governments who were not willing to accept Russia in the 90s when it was a democracy and were not willing to accept Yeltsin, then they began to roll out red carpet for Vladimir Putin when he came to power with all the consequences that we just discussed. This is just absolutely astonishing to think, but that's how it happened. So I think, and it's not important just to remember this and to talk about this in the past, but again, as a historian, I believe that lessons of history are very important for the future. And I think it is very important for Western countries not to make that mistake again. So I talked about a few minutes ago how it's important for us not to mess up again, like our parents' generation did in the 90s, and to be ready for that next moment of change. I think it's equally important that the Western governments and Western countries stand ready the next time Russia embarks on a democratic transition, to welcome and to embrace that future democratic Russia, as opposed to shun it and throw it away like we did in the 90s.
Sally?
What was the relationship between Bill Browder and Nemtsov? And was there any?
First of all, I'm not even sure that they'd ever met. When a lot of people assume, so when we were working on the Magnitsky Act, it's something I briefly mentioned in the film, and of course Boris was instrumental, as Senator McCain says, there would not have been a Magnitsky Act in the
Does
US without
everyone know
Boris
what the
Nemtsov.
Magnitsky Act is? Can you just give a high level?
Of course. So the Magnitsky Act was a law that was passed in 2012 in the United States. And it's a law that introduced what should really be a very, very simple principle, that people who engage in corruption and human rights violations in their own country, in this case in Russia, will no longer be allowed to receive visas to the US, own assets in the US, or use the financial and banking system of the US. Because for years, that's precisely what's been happening. The same people who are undermining and attacking and abusing the most basic norms of rule of law and democracy in Russia have been themselves enjoying, the protections and privileges and perks of democracy in the West, because it's in the West where they send their children to schools, where they open bank accounts, when they buy real estate, and not just in the US, in Western European countries too. And this has been happening for years, and this is, of course, phenomenal hypocrisy on their part. But, from our point of view, this also constitutes enabling on the part of Western governments, because if you welcome the people who perpetrate corruption and human rights abuses in Russia on your soil and in your banks, then you are enabling corruption and human rights abuses in Russia.
And
so
Bill Browder is was a former hedge fund manager, ran money in, ex-Solomon guy, ran money in Russia. His grandfather was the founder of the American Communist Party, and
Yeah.
Sergei Magnitsky was his lawyer, who was killed in prison.
Right, so he discovered a massive tax fraud
And
scheme
tortured.
involving government officials. For that he was arrested, tortured, and killed in prison. And so Bill had this idea that let's kind of put a stop to all of this, and the bulk of that stolen money, of course, again, went to the West. So he had this idea back in 2010 that let's do something about it. If we cannot for now get any justice or any accountability inside of Russia while this regime remains in power, let's do it internationally. And so he had this idea to begin to lobby for this law, named in honor of Sergei Magnitsky, his lawyer, that would put down this principle that those people who are engaging in these types of behavior in their own countries will no longer be able to come and enjoy the privileges of the Western world. And when the first Magnitsky bill was introduced in 2010, it only concerned the Magnitsky case itself. So it only applied to people who either were involved in the fraud scheme that he uncovered or in his own persecution and murder. Well, we were coming from this, and so Boris Nemtsov became involved in 2010, and he got me to become involved also at the end of 2010. And our goal was to widen out the scope of the law, and to make it apply not just to the Magnitsky case, which is very important, of course, but also to other gross human rights violations, because the whole point for us is to introduce accountability and to end impunity. And so for people who are engaged in this type of behavior, that they will know that even if for now they'll have total impunity in Russia, there will be consequences on the international stage. And so we managed to do this. We succeeded in widening the scope of this law, and then to helping persuade members of Congress to pass it. And as you heard Senator McCain saying, there would not have been a Magnitsky law in the US without Boris Nemtsov. I think that's a very strong statement coming from a United States senator. And I have to say that I only met, and a lot of people assume since I was working on the Magnitsky Act since 2010 that we were doing this together with Bill Browder. I only met Bill Browder 1 month after we got the Magnitsky law passed in the US. I met him when we were both testifying in the Canadian Parliament on their own version of Magnitsky law. That's the first time I met him. Never met him before. And I'm not even sure, hesitate to say because I don't know. I can certainly say that I was never together with Boris Nemtsov and Bill Browder at the same time. And I'm not even sure that they've ever met in person ever. I'll ask Bill about this when I see him, because that's even interesting for me now that you raised this question. But
a book called Red Notice that's very interesting
yes,
to read
it's a
about
fascinating
this
book.
whole case.
But I can say that whatever we did, whatever work we did in the Magnitsky law, it was separate from what Bill was doing. I think he's doing a very important work. This is a great effort that he's initiated, but we were kind of coming at it from our own perspective. When the Magnitsky Act was passed, for Bill, the main kind of premise of it was to bring some accountability for the people who killed his lawyer, tortured, arrested, and killed him. From our point of view, this is generally a very pro-Russian law. When the Magnitsky law was passed in the US, the day it was voted on in the US House of Representatives, Boris and I were sitting on the gallery in the US House chamber in Washington watching how they were voting on this. And Boris said this is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country. Because if you think about it, it's the law that holds accountable people, the people who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. And so I often quote this phrase that the Magnitsky Act is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country. And since then, since the US, there have been 4 other countries that have passed it, Canada and the 3 Baltic states. And we're very much continuing to work. In others, in 3 days I'll be in London to testify the British Parliament on this very same issue. And then soon we're also hoping to get some movement in Scandinavian countries, Denmark or Norway.
But no France and Germany, why not?
No, we work in many
Why
countries.
isn't it passed there? Of course you're working everywhere. The money in the Riviera.
Well, let's start with the fact that it was enormously difficult to pass it anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think actually, given the prevalence, the continuing prevalence of realpolitik and cynicism, it's actually astonishing that so many countries already have it. But to answer your question, why not? I mean, I remember a couple of years ago now, I guess, there was a British parliamentary delegation that came to visit Moscow. And they had a lot of meetings with officials, foreign ministry and the Duma and so on. And I got a call from the British ambassador saying that, would I come in and have like a breakfast meeting with them to give them an opposition perspective, so that they would hear the other side as well. And I said, sure, I'm happy to do this. So I came to it was not the embassy, it was the British ambassador's residence, which, as you know, is just across from the Kremlin, literally across the river. That was the old British embassy.
Yes.
It's now the residence of the ambassador. And we were having this breakfast meeting, and there were maybe 7 or 8 members of parliament from different parties. And so I was talking about the internal situation in Russia, what we were facing. It was the Duma election campaign at the time, so I was talking a little bit about that. And then I mentioned how important it would be for the UK to join this process and to pass its own Magnitsky law. And I have to say that most members of the delegation responded very positively, but there was this one guy who was a Conservative MP, I'm not going to say his name, who basically launched into this massive diatribe at me, giving me this lecture of how, which basically the essence of what he was saying was, why should the City of London voluntarily turn away the money that's flowing in at it from different parts of the world? And basically we don't care who and where it's coming from, it's coming to us, so we're happy to have it. And I remember sitting there, so this was at the residence of the British ambassador, so just across the river from the Kremlin. And so just a few hundred yards from the place where Boris was killed, and where there is still that memorial where people bring flowers, and we're just sitting a few hundred yards
It's
from
a
where
living memorial. The government doesn't agree. They clear off the flowers every
they reappear the
once
next
in a while.
morning.
So
And so we
not
were sitting just a
officially
few
sanctioned.
hundred yards of where the leader of the opposition was assassinated. And to this day, there's continuing impunity and cover-up for the organizers and masterminds of this assassination, the most high-profile political assassination in Russia, in modern Russia. And I was sitting there, still with a cane after the first poisoning, hardly just being very fortunate to even be there. And there's this guy looking at me and saying, we need the money, so we're not going to do this. I have to say, honestly, I had nothing to respond to him. But I'll be in London in a few days, and I don't want, not everybody at all is like this. This is the egregious example, so that's why I always mention it.
Skripal incident
But
has
the,
maddened them a little.
right, so we'll see how that's a hearing on human rights in Russia to be held at the British Parliament on Tuesday, so we'll see how that goes.
Alex.
Yeah, there's like a really strong anti-war kind of messaging in the movie. What did Nemtsov say about Syria and about Putin's moves there, and maybe some of your thoughts about Syria today and Russian interference there?
So first, you're absolutely right. I mean, he was kind of this anti-war theme went throughout his political life. He collected 1 million signatures against the war in Chechnya while being a serving governor. He could be dismissed at any time, but he did this and he brought it to the Kremlin. And he was also, of course, against the second war in Chechnya, called for direct talks with a separatist leadership, after which Putin said that he should resign from parliament, which I briefly mentioned in the film. And he was, of course, probably the leading political figure in Russia who opposed Putin's war on Ukraine. And he organized and led 2 marches against the war in Ukraine through the streets of Moscow in March and in September of 2014. And he was going to lead another one in March of 2015, which turned into a march in his memory. He didn't really have time what I mean is he didn't live long enough to talk really about Syria, because the major military involvement by Putin, I think, began in December of 2015. He was killed in February. So there were some initial moves, and I think actually he did have a few comments on these preliminary steps. And he commented on it in very much the same way as he did on all the other wars that Putin was initiating. That first of all, it's not Russia's war, it's Putin's war and his regime's war for their own purposes. And that, there's absolutely no reason and no national interest of the Russian people involved in going halfway across the world to prop up a fellow dictator, because that's the only reason Putin is there. I mean, the other reason is the propaganda value that he thinks he's getting out of it, by presenting himself as a strong man on television who can, at a moment's notice, take half his air force across the world and show to these Americans and all the rest of it. So the propaganda kind of fodder, and helping a fellow dictator like he tried to do in Ukraine but failed with Yanukovych. So I think had Boris been alive today, I have absolutely no doubt what he would have thought and said, and very loudly and publicly so, about Putin's war in Syria.
Any other questions? Yes.
So in light of the physical risk to you, because of your promoting this film and being a part of Open Russia, how do you weigh your desire to see an open Russia with the risk to yourself and what that means for your wife and your family?
Well, on this precise point, my wife and my children are outside of Russia, and many of us in the opposition have had to do that, because it's one thing what we do. This is our choice. This is our life. This is what we choose to do. We don't have the right to put families at risk. So my wife and children are outside of Russia. So are many of my colleagues also. So that's the first thing. Other than that, there's not that much we can do. I mean, I can't stop eating or breathing or drinking, when I'm in Russia. Frankly, I think it's like a human self-defense mechanism. You cannot live in constant paranoia and just walk around and think, oh, what's going to happen? You just don't do that. You just don't focus on it. So having families in a safe place, that's really the only practical thing we can do, and that's what a lot of us have. Other than that, I mean, I guess we could always just give up and run, but we don't want to do that. We do not want to do that. I think that'd be the biggest gift we could give to the Kremlin. It would be to give up and run, and we're not going to give them that.
Sheila.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Trump government and Putin and your perception of what's going on?
Did they do it? Did they meddle in our elections?
You mean you're talking about the meddling, or you're talking about generally?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Everything.
Well, I have to say, and especially when this administration only came into office, I had a lot of questions from journalists about this same issues, and there's going to be a really pro-Putin administration now in the White House, a U.S. president who wants to be friends with Vladimir Putin. And I would always respond to that, well, what's new? George Bush looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul. Obama declared a reset with Putin and praised the great work Vladimir Putin is doing on behalf of the Russian people. That's a quote. Now you have this guy. The style may be different, probably is. I think I'll leave it to you to judge that. There are enough Russians seemingly trying to meddle into your U.S. domestic politics. I don't want to be one more, so I don't think it's my place to comment on specifically on your domestic political issues. But in terms of the relationship between the U.S. administration and Putin, every U.S. president who was in power under Putin, probably maybe with the exception of Bill Clinton, because he was only there for like a year, so I don't think it's fair to judge on the basis of that. But certainly Bush, certainly Obama, and from what people say, the current administration are trying to be friends with Mr. Putin. And again, we've talked about this just a minute ago, how, in my view, short-sighted this position is. And by the way, if you look at those previous presidents, they all ended in a very different position from where they began. They started off trying to be friends with Putin, and then they realized that it's not possible by the end of their terms, both Bush and Obama, because, well, I think it's just frankly pretty obvious that there cannot be a convergence of interest or even any kind of a genuine partnership and cooperation between, on one hand, a democracy that is the US, and on the other hand, an autocratic, corrupt, authoritarian regime that is the regime of Vladimir Putin. And they all found this out in a hard way. I wish more people learned from the mistakes of others as opposed to having to repeat them, all of that again, but that's how it is.
Question?
What about the meddling?
Do you think they meddled?
I think that
Totally
if it's,
meddled.
first of all, I don't want to prejudge the outcome of all these probes and hearings and investigations, but if it is found and proven that the Kremlin has tried to meddle in US elections, I don't think that should come as a surprise to anybody. The Putin regime has been meddling in elections for years. Of course, first of all, it's been meddling with elections in Russia. Because when Putin came to power, Russia had democratic elections, and now we don't. So those are the first elections they meddled with. But then, of course, increasingly they began to cross the borders, and they tried to meddle in countries like Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, and post-Soviet states mostly. Then further into the west of Europe. Just a few years ago, and this is only what we know from public information. We can only imagine what's happening behind the scenes, but we know from public information that there was a multi-million euro loan issued from a Moscow-connected bank to the far-right Front National party in France out of the French elections.
Yes.
This was, I think, 2013, it's about 5 years ago now, 14 even, 4 years ago. And so, you know, if it's proven that they've been trying to do some stuff here, what's the surprise? Why shouldn't they? And again, with those previous instances, there was no reaction, there was no response, nothing was happening. So if you're a KGB dictator, then and you do these things and nothing happens, and that's an invitation for you to carry on doing it again. So I would not be surprised at all if it's proven that was the case.
Questions? Did you have a question? Go ahead.
It's about Winter Olympic Games in Sochi. So I believe that it was very impressive, the statistics, the numbers that was shown in the presentation. So were there consequences after that presentation? Is it like positive, negative, and how it was taken by people? So
You mean Boris's report into the corruption in Sochi Olympics,
Yeah.
right? So that's actually one of the things, when in the interview, this didn't make it into the film because I had to keep the film realistic. I could make a film about Boris that would last 2 weeks, but I wanted to make it, you know, watchable. So a lot of the things that that were really interesting, I couldn't put it in. But we actually do have on the film's website, we have some of the clips that did make it into the film. And one of the things is Alexei Navalny saying that the thing that Boris did was that he always created new directions for the opposition. He created something new that hadn't existed before him. And now everybody's accepting this as a very important kind of component of what we do. And one of those new things were these investigative reports that you were mentioning, the white papers, whatever you want to call them. So beginning in 2008, he began to produce these white papers, these investigative reports, into certain areas, aspects of the current regime in Russia, the corruption, what they did with Gazprom, the personal privileges and perks that the key figures in the regime were
Navalny's
using.
now doing a lot of that too, right?
Yes, and everybody else, not just Navalny, a lot of people, Yashin, other people, but this was started by Boris Nemtsov. He was the first one who did this. And so his last report was on corruption in the Sochi Olympics. This was published and produced. And by the way, the way he would distribute them, of course they are online, obviously, but apart from that, he would literally print, you know, tens of thousands of paper copies, and volunteers would distribute them on the streets and metro stations, and he would always do it himself. I showed briefly in the film how he's in a metro train in Moscow distributing those leaflets and those reports, and it was really funny, by the way, riding the metro with him, because you would enter a train car and all the heads would turn in a second. He would take the metro quite often because, you know, as you know, traffic in Moscow is probably as bad as you have here, or even maybe worse. So you could either spend 3 hours in a car or 20 minutes in metro. He preferred 20 minutes in metro. So he would personally take part in the distribution of those reports, and so his last report was the one you mentioned on corruption in Sochi Olympics, and he put together all these facts about how, and it's, by the way, was one of his reports that was actually translated into English, and we present the last ever time that he came to the US, we went with him to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to present the English language version of the report in Sochi Olympics. This was in January of 2014, a year before he was killed. And so he put together the facts of nepotism of these companies and people close to Putin that suddenly received no $1 billion worth of contracts. He presented just the facts about the Olympics, and my favorite one was that I think it was like a 15-mile stretch of road that the Rotenbergs built, and Rotenbergs are Putin's oligarch friends. They got the no-bid contract again. And I think it was a 15-mile stretch of the road from the airport to Sochi, and that road cost more than the entire NASA program for Mars exploration.
But the
These
vodka
are official
didn't fall
figures.
over, right, on the dash?
Maybe even it did. I don't know.
At 14
Maybe it was
miles.
a good road. But so he put together things like this, and I think just as all of his reports, they had an impact. I think his report that had the biggest impact, of course, was the report on Lushkov, after which Lushkov was actually fired in 2010.
Lushkov was the mayor,
was the
of
mayor
Moscow.
of Moscow, who was mayor of Moscow for 18 years.
Like statues.
Same, yeah, we still have them. He's gone with the statues.
Big,
as well.
ugly statues.
Yeah, he had a peculiar sense of taste in art, shall we say. But I think the Lushkov was the most impactful one in the practical ways. On the Sochi Olympics, well, I think the main way we measure impact is that a lot of people read them and found out these facts, of course, because of course if you watch Russian state TV, you wouldn't know anything about this. The only way people knew was from things like the reports that Boris produced. And of course now we know, and I remember when we were presenting this report with him, he said that the Sochi Olympics would be the biggest fraud scheme of the Putin regime, and he didn't even know how true that was, because of course since his death there's all these now
Icarus
reports,
yeah.
yes, of the doping and all these state-sponsored doping scandals. So it was even more of a fraud than he thought it was, but he meant it in the most direct way, of the billions of dollars that was stolen or put into pockets of people close to Putin on these Olympic projects. And of course the Sochi Olympics, that's another fact that I remember from his report. The Sochi Olympics was more expensive than all the Winter Olympics together combined for the previous 80 years. The most expensive in history.
Any other questions? I was struck by something that was said in the movie when Boris said that he continues to do his work because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't.
Yeah.
And he couldn't just be a bystander. And it reminds me of some of the, I think there were six protesters who went on Red Square when seven when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia or Budapest. I get them confused. And
actually, thank you for mentioning this, because
yeah.
A few years ago my first documentary film was actually about the Soviet dissident movement, and so I interviewed the people who were still alive then. So when I was making the film, 4 out of the 7 were still alive. Now there are only 2 left. But one of those who went out, so this was in August of 1968 when Brezhnev sent tanks to invade Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring. And 7 people came out onto Red Square in Moscow in a protest demonstration against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and they were all arrested, sent to prisons, to camps, to internal confinement, or to psychiatric hospitals, which was the worst of all. And so this is what happened to Natalia Gorbanevska. She was one of the 7. And I interviewed her in 2005. And I asked her this precise question. I asked, why did you do this? I mean, you knew exactly what's going to happen. There was no doubt that if you went to protest against the Soviet regime in Moscow in 1968, there's no doubt.
A little bit like you going back to Russia.
Well, I mean,
You're brave.
I'm just stubborn, that's different. But she definitely was brave. And I asked her, why did you do this? And she had 2 small children. She actually went to the demonstration with a pram, with a stroller. She had her baby son in there. And I said, why did you do this? You knew the consequence. You knew what was going to happen. And she said to me something I will never forget. She said, going to that demonstration, for me, was a selfish act. And I said, what do you mean selfish act? And she said, I wanted to have a clean conscience. And that's a very powerful motivation. I know it was for Boris. I know it is for me. I know it's for a lot of people. Maybe we're a little bit selfish that way. But just as you said, if we just stood by and watched what was happening and did nothing, that would mean that we're also complicit, and we do not want to be complicit in what they're doing.
When we were privatizing trucks, they were technically part of also the military. Like the military could come if they needed the milk truck, they could, I forget the word, I'm forgetting.
Requisition or something
Requisition,
like that.
all the trucks. And so the military tried to stop our privatization, or Nemtsov's right, by saying you can't do this because they're military trucks. And they issued a secret decree, and Nemtsov and Biednikov were at his table, at his desk, and we were here. And they were reading the secret decree. And they said, you can't look at it, you can't look at it. It's secret, you know, but they were telling us what it was, but they still respected it. But we were getting threats, people were gonna shoot our kneecaps off. It was a little scary, right? And he says at the press conference, he says, are you gonna stop are you gonna stop privatizing? And he said, we'll stop privatizing, no, we'll stop privatizing when they start shooting. They were very, very courageous. Are there any other questions? Yes, please, go ahead.
I know it's getting late, but I'm just curious as to the mood inside Russia. Is it like your analogy about hawking the chicken one at a time to avoid the squawking? Is it that people have sort of accepted their fate? They've lived under, the older generation would have lived under this type of regime in the past. I mean, what's going on? Looking from the outside, it's hard to imagine that
What's next?
That's actually how, that's on the young people, that's one of, oh, repeat the question. The question was, what's the mood like in Russia today, and do people just accept what's happening in terms of the authoritarianism, especially some of the older generations who have lived under previous authoritarian regimes? And then you ended with talking about the young generation. That's actually how I was going to respond when you began asking, because the most astonishing thing for me, in a very good way, is that the generation who has seen nothing except Putin, because don't forget, he's been in power for 19 years almost. We now have an entire generation that grew up or was born under him. And in fact, the so-called presidential election we had last month, those Russian citizens who turned 18 and went to vote for the first time were people who were born under Vladimir Putin. This is how long he's been in power. And so you would assume that would be the generation, that would be the brainwashed generation, the people who saw nothing except him, saw only his face on TV, know no other reality, do not know what it's like to have real elections in Russia and so on. And it's true, they don't know all of that. But the amazing thing is that it is that generation that is now at the forefront of this new rising protest movement that we're seeing over the past year. And in the spring of last year, in the spring of 2017, we've had this sudden outbreak of anti-corruption protests across the country, tens of thousands of people taking part, seemingly out of nowhere. We were surprised too, again, in a very good way, and the Kremlin was surprised in a bad way. But tens of thousands of people who have been going to the streets across the country, not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is new for Russia, because everything in Russia political always happens in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and that is it. And these protests have been happening in more than 200 towns and cities, from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk, everywhere.
I don't think that's getting press here, though.
Well, I think that's not a question for us, that's a question for the press here, I'm guessing. But the first wave was back in March, and then the next even bigger wave was in June. Then again in the fall, in January, and then the next big protests are planned for May 5th, which is 2 days before Putin's inauguration. So that we're in the process of kind of getting ready and preparing for that. And I think what's most striking about this new protest movement, first of all, is the geographical spread again, because all things in Russia political are Moscow and Petersburg, and that's it.
Remember my map.
Right, exactly. So they heard you after
They
all these
heard
years.
me.
Not
Well,
the same
slow.
people, but yeah. And now it's truly national, and that is important. But I think what's even more important, frankly, is that the bulk, the absolute vast majority of those protesters were between the ages of 17 and 25. That's the young generation. That's the people who know nothing except Putin, and yet they're increasingly beginning to say enough and come out to the demonstrations despite the risks and the dangers and the arrests. I mean, to go and demonstrate against Putin in Russia is not like to go and demonstrate against your president here. I mean, here you're protected by police, you have your First Amendment rights. In Russia, you're beaten up by police if you go and demonstrate against the regime. You get sent to prison for nothing. And so many of them were sent to prison on, I think on the 12th of June, which was the second wave of protest. More than 1,700 people were arrested on just one single day and put into jails and prison cells for nothing. And then what was really heartening is that, you know, a lot of these youngsters who were given 10 or 15-day jail sentences just for coming out to peacefully protest. And when those sentences were up, many of them were met by journalists as they were coming out of the cells. And a lot of journalists were asking, well, you know, you are, whatever, 18 years old, you went to a peaceful protest, you got 15 days in prison for that for nothing. So presumably you're not going to do that again. And the vast majority of people said, no. Now we're definitely going out the next time. And so there was an even bigger wave in autumn, and then we'll see what happens in, well, 5th of May is only, a couple of weeks away now, actually. Yeah, it's pretty close. So I think it's very heartening. I think it could potentially be a turning point just because of the demographic composition. Putin's turning 66 this year. The bulk of the protesters are under the age of 30. That's not a good demographic contrast to have for him. It is for us. And I would say that, you know, I think it's a very worrying sign for the Kremlin. I would certainly be worried if I were them right now. But I think it's a very hopeful and very promising sign for the future of Russia.
And I think that's a good note to end with. I was going to say, one of the things, he was so courageous and such a fighter, but he fought with such positivity and out of such deep love and respect for his country. And I would hope that we all walk away this evening with a couple of thoughts, but one is to not be a bystander wherever you are. And that's how we can honor him.